At my sister's wedding, my brother said, "You're not family anymore." I had heard angry words from my brother before, but never words that made an entire wedding hall suddenly feel silent. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, I believed family was something that could survive arguments, misunderstandings, and even years of distance. I was wrong. My sister Clara was getting married, and I had spent weeks helping prepare for her big day. I wanted everything to be perfect for her. My wife Dinah was helping with the decorations, while my daughter Millie and my son Robert Dolan had traveled to attend the ceremony. My brother Richard was the oldest of us, and although we had disagreed many times over the years, I never imagined he would publicly turn against me on our sister's wedding day. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Clara looked happier than I had seen her in years, and when she walked down the aisle, I felt tears in my eyes. I remembered the three of us as children, running around our parents' house, arguing over toys and then making up before dinner. I thought those memories meant something to all of us. After the ceremony, everyone gathered for photographs. I stood beside Clara, smiling proudly. Richard was on the other side of her. Then, just before the photographer took the picture, Richard looked at me and said quietly, "You shouldn't be standing here." I thought he was joking. I asked, "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer and said, "You're not family anymore." I stared at him, completely stunned. Clara immediately looked at him and said, "Richard, stop." But he continued. He said I had betrayed the family years ago and had no right to pretend everything was normal. Guests began turning toward us. Dana grabbed my arm, while Robert stepped forward as if he wanted to defend me. I stopped him. This was Clara's wedding, and I refused to create a scene. I simply asked Richard, "What exactly do you think I did?" He looked at me and said, "You know what you did." I didn't. That was the frightening part. I had spent years believing the distance between us was caused by old disagreements about money and our parents' estate. But apparently, Richard believed there was something much bigger. Clara looked heartbroken. She whispered, "Daniel, please not tonight." I nodded and stepped away. I wanted to leave, but something inside me told me that I needed to understand why my brother had said those words. Later that evening, while the reception continued, Clara found me outside the hall. She was crying. She held an old envelope in her hand and said, "Daniel, there's something you need to know about what happened between you and Richard." Then she handed me the envelope. On the front were 3 words written in my father's handwriting: "For Daniel someday." I stared at the envelope in Clara's hands. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. He had been gone for almost 8 years, and seeing those familiar letters brought back memories I had tried to put away. I asked Clara where she had found it. She said she discovered it while helping our mother organize some old belongings before the wedding. She had planned to give it to me after the ceremony, but Richard's outburst had changed everything. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter from my father written several years before his death. The first line made my heart stop. "Daniel, if Richard ever tells you that you betrayed this family, remember that you were trying to protect it." I read the sentence again. Clara watched my face. I asked her whether she knew what the letter meant. She shook her head. "Not everything." I continued reading. My father explained that shortly before his death, he had discovered serious problems involving the family business and the money set aside for Clara's future. Richard had been managing some of the finances because he was the oldest. My father suspected that money had been moved without proper authorization, but he did not want to accuse Richard without evidence. Instead, he asked me to quietly investigate. I remembered that period. I had been living in another city, and my father had called me several times asking questions about bank statements. I had never understood why he seemed so worried. I had assumed it was simply old age and financial stress. The letter explained everything. My father had discovered that money meant for Clara had disappeared from an account. He feared that someone was taking advantage of the family. He asked me to investigate because he trusted me to remain neutral. I had eventually discovered irregular transactions, but before I could confront anyone, my father became seriously ill. He asked me to keep the matter private until we knew the truth. After his death, I had continued investigating. I eventually found evidence that the missing money had not been taken by Richard. Instead, it had been transferred through an account connected to a former business associate of his. I confronted Richard at the time, but he became furious and accused me of trying to destroy his reputation. We argued, and our relationship never fully recovered. I had always believed that was why he hated me. But the letter revealed something else. My father had written that he believed Richard had been manipulated by someone he trusted. He wanted me to protect him, not expose him. I looked at Clara and said, "Why would Richard say I betrayed the family?" She replied, "Because he believes you told Dad something that made him suspicious of him." I shook my head. "I never accused him." Clara looked down. "He thinks you did." Then she told me something that made the situation even more complicated. A few months before the wedding, Richard had discovered an old document that appeared to show I had given our father information about his finances. He believed that document proved I had secretly turned our father against him. But Clara had found another page that contradicted it. That was the page inside the envelope. Before we could continue, Dana came outside. She had been searching for me. She looked at the letter and immediately understood that the secret was finally coming out. She said quietly, "Daniel, there's something I never told you either." I looked at Dana and asked what she had been hiding. She sat beside Clara and explained that she had known about the family dispute for years. She had never known every detail, but she knew my father had asked me to investigate something before he died. She also knew Richard believed I had betrayed him. I asked why she never told me that Richard still felt that way. Dana said she had tried several times, but every conversation ended with me saying I wanted to leave the past behind. She thought she was protecting our marriage by not reopening old wounds. I understood her intention, but I wish she had told me. Clara then said there was another reason Richard had become so angry. She had recently discovered that the family property might have been transferred incorrectly after our father died. The property included a small building that had belonged to our parents for decades. Richard believed I had secretly taken control of it. I told Clara that wasn't true. I had never claimed ownership. I had actually refused the property because I didn't want another argument with Richard. Clara looked surprised. "Then why does Richard think you took it?" I said I didn't know. We decided to find out. The next morning, I went through my old files. I found copies of the estate documents. One page showed that I had signed away any claim to the property. Another document showed that Richard had received a larger share of the estate because he was responsible for managing our mother's care. That had never bothered me. I had accepted it because I trusted my brother. But another page was missing. Clara believed the missing page might explain why Richard thought I had done something wrong. We contacted the lawyer who had handled our father's estate. He agreed to review the records. While we waited, Richard called me. His voice was cold. He said, "You should have stayed away from the wedding." I asked him why. He replied, "Because you always think you're better than everyone else." I told him that wasn't true. I said I only wanted to understand what he believed I had done. He said, "You know exactly what you did to Dad." I answered, "Dad trusted me." Richard immediately became angry. "That's exactly the problem. He trusted you more than me." Then he hung up. His words stayed with me. I realized that maybe the real issue wasn't money. It was the feeling that our father had chosen me over him. But that wasn't what happened. Our father had simply asked me for help because I lived farther away and wasn't involved in the family business. Later that day, the estate lawyer contacted us. He had found the missing page. It contained an amendment that changed everything. The property had not been given to me. It had been placed into a family trust with Clara named as the primary beneficiary. Richard had never been told because our father had wanted to discuss it privately after completing another document. That explained why Richard thought I had stolen something from him. But it raised another question. Who had shown Richard the false document? Clara looked at me and said, "I think I know." Clara told us that a former business associate of Richard had recently contacted him. His name was Thomas, and he had worked with our family years earlier. I remembered him because he had been involved in several financial discussions with my father. Clara said Thomas had been telling Richard that I had manipulated our father into changing the estate. According to Thomas, I had convinced our father to remove Richard from certain decisions. Richard believed him. I couldn't understand why Thomas would do this. The estate lawyer suggested we review old business records. When we did, we discovered that Thomas had once been involved in a disagreement over money that belonged to our family. My father had refused to continue working with him. After that, Thomas disappeared from our lives. Now he had returned through Richard. I told Clara that we needed to speak to Richard calmly. We arranged a meeting at our mother's house. Richard arrived angry and defensive. I placed the estate documents on the table and said, "I want you to read these before you accuse me of anything else." He looked at the papers and became silent. Clara explained that the property had been placed in a family trust, not given to me. Richard read the amendment several times. Then he asked, "Why didn't Dad tell me?" I answered honestly, "I don't know. Maybe he intended to." Richard looked at me. "You knew about this?" I told him I had not. He seemed shocked. I explained that I had never seen the document until recently. Richard sat down. For the first time, his anger disappeared and I saw something else in his face, regret. He admitted that Thomas had shown him a document suggesting I had convinced our father to change the estate. He had believed it because he was already angry with me. He said Thomas told him that I had taken money from the family business. I asked Richard whether he had checked the claim. He admitted he hadn't. "I wanted to believe it," he said quietly. That sentence hurt more than his words at the wedding. I asked him why. He said he had spent years feeling like our father trusted me more than him. He believed I had become the favorite son, and that he had been left responsible for everything. I told him that was never how I saw it. I reminded him that he had taken care of our mother, managed the house and handled responsibilities I couldn't. I had always been grateful. Richard started crying. He said he had carried resentment for years because he thought we decided that the family property would remain in the trust, exactly as my father had intended. No one would use it as a reason to fight. Clara could decide its future with the family's support. As for the old business records, we gave them to the appropriate authorities and professionals. Thomas was eventually held accountable for falsifying records and misleading people. We never sought revenge. We simply wanted the truth established. Several months later, Richard visited my house. He brought an old box from our parents' home. Inside were childhood photographs. He said, "I thought you should have these." We sat together looking through them. One photograph showed the three of us standing beside our father. We were young, smiling, and completely unaware of the arguments that would one day separate us. Richard pointed at the picture and said, "I wish we could go back to that day." I told him we couldn't, but we could decide what happened next. He nodded. Then he asked me whether I would stand beside him at a family gathering the following month. I smiled. Of course. He looked relieved, but before he left, he said something I never expected. "Daniel, I was wrong when I said you weren't family anymore." I looked at him and replied, "You were wrong, but you're still my brother." That conversation became the beginning of a slow reconciliation. Richard didn't suddenly become a different person, and neither did I. We still disagreed about things, but we started talking instead of assuming. We began visiting our mother together and sharing responsibilities. Clara became the bridge between us. Although we told her she didn't have to fix every problem, Robert and Millie encouraged us to create new family traditions. Instead of constantly discussing the past, we started having Sunday dinners together. The first few were uncomfortable. Everyone was careful with their words, but gradually laughter returned. One evening, Richard brought up the wedding. He apologized again, but this time I stopped him. I told him he didn't need to apologize every time we met. What mattered was what he did going forward. He agreed. Clara told us that she had been afraid her wedding would always be remembered as the day the family broke apart. Instead, she wanted it to be remembered as the day we finally confronted what had been dividing us. That thought stayed with me. Sometimes a painful event can become the beginning of something. Better if people are willing to face it, Dinah, and I also talked about how easily misunderstandings can grow. She admitted that she had avoided asking Richard what he really believed because she feared another argument. I told her that silence often makes assumptions stronger. We agreed to be more direct with one another. Robert asked me whether I regretted not confronting Richard at the wedding. I told him no. I was glad I had stepped away because it allowed Clara to have the ceremony she deserved. He said he admired that decision. I told him that sometimes walking away isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to keep anger from controlling the moment. A year later, Clara and her husband hosted a small family dinner to celebrate their anniversary. Everyone was there. Richard stood beside me and joked that he still couldn't believe how dramatic the wedding had become. Clara laughed and said, "You made it dramatic." He admitted it. We all laughed. Then he raised his glass and said, "To family. Even when we're difficult." Everyone smiled. I looked around the table and felt grateful. The old conflict hadn't disappeared from our history, but it no longer controlled our present. My father's letters had helped us understand what he wanted for us. He didn't want his children fighting over possessions. He wanted us to remain connected. Before dinner ended, Richard handed me another photograph. It was a picture of our parents from their younger years. On the back, my father had written a sentence. "Take care of each other when I'm gone." I read it twice. Richard looked at me and said, "I think we finally understand." I nodded. "I think so." That night, after everyone left, I sat with Dana on the porch. She asked me whether I ever imagined that one sentence at a wedding could change so much. I told her no. "You're not family anymore," had sounded like the end of a relationship. But it became the beginning of a much-needed conversation. Dana smiled and said, "Sometimes people say things in anger that they don't truly mean." I replied, "And sometimes people believe things because they're afraid to ask for the truth." We sat quietly. I thought about my father, my siblings, and the years we had lost to assumptions. I wished we had talked sooner, but I also knew regret couldn't change the past. What we could change was the future. That became the lesson I carried with me. Family isn't defined by perfect behavior. It's defined by the willingness to repair what has been broken. Years have passed since my sister's wedding, but I still remember the moment my brother looked at me and said, "You're not family anymore." I remember the shock in his voice, the silence around us, and the way Clara looked as if her wedding had suddenly become someone else's battlefield. But when I look back now, I no longer hear those words as the final statement they once seemed to be. I hear them as the beginning of a truth that our family had avoided for too long. Richard had been carrying resentment. I had been carrying assumptions of my own. Clara had been caught between us. Dana had tried to protect everyone by staying quiet. And our father had left behind letters, because he knew that someday we might need to understand the truth. The old financial dispute was eventually resolved. Thomas's deception was exposed, and the family property remained protected. None of that mattered as much to me as the fact that my brother and I had found our way back to each other. We couldn't recover every lost year, but we could stop losing more. Richard became someone I could call again. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Sometimes we argued about sports or whose cooking was better. Those ordinary conversations meant more to me than any grand apology. Clara's marriage grew stronger, and she often joked that her wedding had given our entire family more drama than anyone had asked for. We laughed about it because we could finally laugh. Robert and Millie grew closer to their uncle too. They never forgot what happened, but they saw the effort Richard made afterward. One evening, Robert asked him directly why he had believed Thomas without checking the facts. Richard answered honestly, "Because I was angry. And anger makes easy stories feel true." That answer stayed with me. It reminded me how dangerous assumptions can become when people refuse to talk. I learned that family conflicts rarely begin with one dramatic event. They often begin with small misunderstandings, unanswered questions, old disappointments, and feelings that nobody wants to admit. If those things remain hidden long enough, they can become walls. But walls can come down when people are willing to speak honestly. My father once wrote, "Take care of each other when I'm gone." For years, I thought those words were about protecting our family financially. Now I understand they were about something much more important. He wanted us to protect our relationships. Money can be replaced. Property can be sold. Documents can be corrected. But years of lost family time can never be completely recovered. That is why I no longer take ordinary conversations for granted. If someone in my family is upset, I ask. If there is a misunderstanding, I try to clear it up. If I make a mistake, I admit it. And if someone I love makes a mistake, I try to leave room for them to make things right. On the anniversary of Clara's wedding, our entire family gathered again. Richard stood beside me in the same place, where he had once told me I wasn't family anymore. This time he put his arm around my shoulder and said, "You know, Daniel, I think Dad would be happy." I smiled and said, "I think he would." Clara joined us and laughed. "Just don't start arguing today." Richard and I looked at each other and promised we wouldn't. We kept that promise. That evening I realized something simple but powerful. Being family isn't about never hurting each other. It's about refusing to let one painful moment define the entire relationship. My brother had once pushed me away with 7 words. Years later, he brought me back with something much stronger, his actions. And that is the part of the story I choose to remember. Not the anger, not the accusation, not the wedding that almost became a family disaster. I remember the day we finally chose to listen, forgive, and rebuild. Because sometimes the people who say, "You're not family anymore," are the same people who are secretly hoping you'll give them a reason to believe that family can still come back together. If you like this video, response us by comment. Tell your places where you are looking from it. Make me happy to see people from different places. And don't forget to subscribe channel for more videos.